The building blocks of your mental health are coping mechanisms. When you think about physical health, a lot of people think like, oh, I have to exercise, I have to eat right, I have to take care of my body. When you think about mental health, the most important building block is how you cope, how you communicate, and how you take care of your mind. Coping mechanisms are the way that you deal with difficult events in your life. You cope every single day. You cope with your friends, you cope with your families, you cope with school, you cope with extracurricular activities, you cope with worrying about your future and if you're doing everything correctly. You cope with a lot of different elements. And then a mechanism is really just a fancy way of saying like a behavior or a strategy or something that you're trying to do. So when we put those two words together, coping, you're trying to address different things or handle or try different things in your life, and a mechanism is a strategy for how to do that. The most important thing for you to know is that your coping mechanisms are wired in your brain. The longer you do something, the better you get at it. So if you look at like the world's top athletes, these are people who no longer have to think about their actions. When Serena Williams is on the tennis court, she's not thinking, I have to move my arm back and hit this yellow ball. If she thought that, she would never see that ball. It's automatic. When LeBron James or Steph Curry or someone is shooting, they're not thinking about that shot. It's automatic. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of our brains, that when we learn new behaviors and when we do different things, the longer we do it, the better we get at it. So when you learn to play an instrument, when you learn to play a sport, when you learn to ride a bike, when you learn to get really good at video games, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And that's awesome. But our brains also have a downside with that. And I learned that downside in a really difficult way. When I was 11 years old, I went through a lot of major loss. I visited my oldest brother in a psychiatric ward. 2 months after I visited my brother, my grandmother died. 10 months after that, my best friend was killed in a car accident. And 2 months after that, my grandfather died. So between the ages of 11 and 12, I went through significant trauma and loss. And no one ever came to me when I was 12 and said, hey, here's how you cope with this. What I started doing was just trying to figure it out on my own. At age 12, when I was constantly getting shuttled between hospitals and funerals, I wasn't good at like philosophizing about life and death. What I learned at a really young age was that I was good at making people laugh. And so that's what I did. I went to all these really difficult events and I made everyone laugh, but I never shared my own emotions. I never shared what I was going through. And then around age 12, I started drinking alcohol. And it wasn't every day. It was probably 2 to 4 times a month. But I noticed that when I drank, it helped me feel numb and it helped take that pain away. And you might think like, okay, not a big deal. You did that when you were 11 or 12. But these were the coping mechanisms I used through age 13, 14, 15, 16, all the way up until I was 22. And it just kept getting worse. By the time I was in high school, I was hiding my emotions so much that when I got to my senior year and went through a deep depression, I became suicidal and didn't tell anyone. I kept hiding. I kept drinking. And I continued those patterns, much like people learn those patterns and those skills for good things. I learned those coping mechanisms and repeated them in a way that the deeper they got, the harder it was to change them. And so one of the most frustrating things for everyone is that a lot of times we think like we're coping with a cause or a problem. So let's say you don't like your sibling and you cope with that by not talking to them, or you cope with that by slamming the door, or you cope with that by like excluding them from things and being alone. What's actually happening is you have a cause of stress, your sibling, but it makes you feel all kinds of different ways: frustrated, angry, unseen, hurt, upset, jealous, whatever it is. And then you're actually coping with that emotion. So as you think about coping mechanisms, it's really important to understand there is a cause of stress, a feeling from that cause of stress, and then a coping mechanism to deal with those feelings. When people think like, oh, I'm just coping with this cause of stress, they make really big decisions. Like, I'm just not gonna talk to my sibling anymore, or I'm never gonna be friends with this person again, or I'm gonna stop going to school because I don't like school anymore. But it's not the cause of stress that you're actually coping with. You're coping with the frustration, anger, loneliness, other emotions that you feel from those causes. And once you separate a cause of stress from the feelings, from the coping mechanisms, it just allows you to see that map a lot clearer. So once you've been able to understand what a coping mechanism is, you can identify your cause, you can identify your feelings and the coping mechanisms you're using, well then it's a good idea to consider, is the coping mechanism I'm using effective or is it ineffective? One of the best answers I ever got when I asked this question was somebody said that their ineffective coping mechanism was eating Nutella. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound that ineffective. And then they shared that they eat like a Costco-sized jar of Nutella. And I was like, okay, well, that is definitely ineffective. So let's talk about coping mechanisms and how they can be ineffective or effective. Effective coping mechanisms, easiest definition, is it is something that builds you, your mental health, your physical health, and your relationships. So while we're talking about coping mechanisms, I want to share one of my favorite, which is running. I went through a lot of pain when I was young. Some of that pain was from trauma, from loss, from the pain of having bipolar disorder and depression and suicidal thoughts. And what I learned at a really young age was that when I ran, I could relieve that pain. I went through 6 years of immense self-hatred. I started hating myself because I couldn't control my emotions. I started hating myself because I had to leave college, because I had to go through a lot of disappointment and frustration and anger. And when I couldn't control how to stop it, I also couldn't control the way people treated me, being made fun of, being called names, losing my friends. And that self-hatred built in such a terrible way that I was hurting myself. Running helped me get out of that. Running helped release energy, release emotions, and really helped me focus on my own mind and hear my own internal voice in a different way. It's important for all of us to find a coping mechanism that does that. For some people, it's drawing, it's coloring, it's listening to music, it's writing music, it's playing an instrument, it's talking to a friend, it's finding a connection to yourself in a way that helps you. Self-hatred never helped me. The pain from bipolar disorder, depression, all of the things, negative things I said to myself didn't help me. And so running is what works for me. But it's really important to think about what works for you. When did your coping mechanism start? We start coping before we're even aware of it. So it's really important for you to think about when you cope. Do you cry? Do you shut down? Do you not talk to people? Do you isolate yourself? Do you hurt yourself? Do you use substances? What is it that you do to make yourself feel better when you're in a state of emotional pain? When people can't see that external pain because it's not a broken leg, because it's not something physical, it's inside of you. How do you take what's inside of you and bring it out? How do you take that internal life and make it external? And hopefully you can find ways to do it effectively. Hopefully you can find ways to draw or color or write or paint or talk or listen to music or even play video games to connect with your friends, but you're finding some way to express that internal pain in a way that's helpful for you and others. In the example I gave you earlier, when I asked this person who was just eating jars of Nutella how their coping mechanism could move from being ineffective to being effective, they answered that they could start putting the Nutella on fruit. That is not wrong. That is not wrong. There's at least some fruit in their diet. They're eating healthier. It's not just Nutella. But that's the kind of mindset that helps you. You don't get to change your coping mechanisms from being completely ineffective to effective all in one leap. So when you're trying to change your coping mechanisms, it's really moving from point A to point B. Point A for me was I was drinking for every emotional trigger I had. Point B would be not drinking for every emotional trigger I had. But you don't jump from point A to point B quickly. It's more like you're at point A and you kind of move here, and then you kind of fall back. Because your brain is hardwired for that coping mechanism, it takes a long time to build new pathways in your brain, to learn new behaviors. So the most important thing on that journey is to celebrate the small wins. When I went from drinking for every kind of emotional trigger I had to not doing it for even just one emotional trigger, that is a small win. That is a victory. If I was able to not drink and run or exercise or talk to a friend or do something else, that is also a small win. In today's world, you are so pressured to have everything figured out, to know what you're doing in school, to know who you are, to have your mental health balanced, that we don't take time to celebrate those small changes in behavior, those small leaps, those small steps that get us to point B. And if you're not taking the time to celebrate those small wins or those small steps, it's going to be really difficult to get to point B because you're always going to be beating yourself up for not changing this behavior. And that's what most people do. They try to change a coping mechanism. They try it for like 2 weeks. It didn't work. So they just go right back to where they were. It's really important to celebrate in every way you can when you have even the smallest change in behavior, because that's what leads to the next giant step.